Hi everyone! So in this tutorial I'm going to take you through a step-by-step process on how to paint a dog nose in acrylics. Now regardless of any nose that I'm painting, I will always map in the shape and the position of the nostrils first, just to make sure that I've got those accurate. Now what I'm starting to do here as well is judge the placement, but also where that darker line in the middle of the nose is going to be. Now not all noses are going to have an obvious dark line in the centre of the nose, but in most cases it is visible. So this, in combination with the nostrils, I like to make sure that I've got in the right place, that they're the right shape and that they're the right size. Now if these things are wrong at this stage, it's going to really draw the viewer's eye to that part of the painting, and because the nose is in the centre of the face, it can be really distracting. So I do always want to make sure that I take the time during these stages to get all of the things mentioned here right. Now when I was happy with the nostril placement and the line in the centre of the nose, this is when I start to map in the main shape of the outside edges. Now I usually start off with the bottom edge because it does have a little bit more of an exaggerated curve, and I do want to make sure that I get that right. Now one of the important things here is you'll see that I haven't continued to map in the shape of that lower edge with black paint. This is because, being a chocolate Labrador, the nose is actually containing a lot more browns, reds, oranges and some pinks. So I don't want to go in and outline my nose with black if it's not required. Now of course if I was drawing a black nose, then that probably would be the case and you would need to be using a lot more of your black and grey colours. But for this, I really felt that a dark brown was more suited. So at this stage, I'm really paying close attention to my lights and my darks. You can see that I've started to mix a lighter colour for the top surface of the nose. Now I'm not worried about the exact colour that I'm using here at all, it is more about my values. I am hinting at my lights and my darks. Now of course this is still not accurate, I'm going to have to reinforce my darks and my lights, but at this stage it's just a mapping in process. Now this first layer also looks pretty terrible. You can still see quite a lot of the green background showing through, but again, because I'm going to be working with numerous layers here and my main aim at this stage is just to map in my lights and my darks, I'm not worried about that at all. So at this stage the second layer is just about reinforcing the first. So I'm going in here making sure that my nostrils are dark enough, and then I'm going to be gradually increasing my brighter layers. Now it's really important at this stage that you don't jump in to add in your brightest highlights early on, because we're going to really limit the amount of depth that we can achieve in the nose. This is also the case when we're drawing fur, and I do have a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for painting realistic fur in acrylics, and that's one of the things that I talk about in that video. If that's of interest, I'll link that in the description below. But I really want to be making sure with this layer that I now start to hide that background colour. Now I like to use Liquitex Basics. They are my paint of choice because I like working with glazes to adjust my colours. Now I do have this chocolate Labrador tutorial also here on YouTube, from that time-lapse version from start to finish with a voiceover. It's packed with loads of tips and techniques, so if you would also like to watch that, then I'll pop that in the description below as well. You'll see there just how many glazes I use throughout that painting process. But because Liquitex Basics are a bit transparent and they work really well for these glazing techniques, it does mean that that first layer can look a little bit messy. But it's fine. This second layer, as you can see, it's really covering that background and it's helping to reinforce our lights and our darks. We're getting a really nice amount of depth. That contrast is really important. So before we start moving on to the next layer, where I'm really going to reinforce more of the three-dimensional shape of this nose, if the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video so far have been useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also have this chocolate Labrador on my Patreon as a full-length real-time tutorial. There are no parts sped up, no sections cut out, and that is available now on my Patreon channel with the reference photo, line art and full material list. So if you would like to paint along to this one, then I will link my Patreon in the description below. So I have now switched over to more of my lighter mixture, and this is where I'm going to be reinforcing that three-dimensional shape. It's really important here with where we position our highlights, because it's at this point where we're going to start to show where the nostrils roll over to that flat front surface of the nose. You'll see that there are no straight lines when I'm painting this section. It is all about the curve and how short those brush strokes need to be. If I make my brush strokes too long here, I'm going to exaggerate the curve on the edge of that nostril. So I do really need to pay attention to three main things: the direction, the length, and the thickness. Now again, this is things that I talk about in that top tips for painting realistic fur in acrylics. These three things, they don't have to be applied just when painting fur. For noses, eyes, anything with a paintbrush, it is the same. The amount of pressure we apply to that brush, we're going to get a range of thicknesses with that brush stroke. So that's something that we need to pay really close attention to. For instance, the technique that I'm doing here for the top surface of the nose is more dots, not polka dots. I don't want them looking like that, but it's definitely not brush strokes. And the difference in technique, the way that we're using the brushes, this is the same brush. I haven't switched that brush yet. But the way that I'm using that brush for this first lighter layer is enabling me to get a range of textures. Now, I have already briefly spoken about how I like to work with glazes, and here is my first glaze when painting this nose. You can see that it's a transparent glaze. It's allowing the lighter layer to show through underneath, and that there is really important. I use water to thin my acrylic paints in order to use them for glazes. I don't use any glazing medium at all, and I find that this works really well for the techniques that I like to use. But you can see that when I'm working with glazes, I'm not applying that one colour everywhere. I want to make sure that I'm looking at that reference photo closely and pinpointing exactly what colour I see where. Because again, whether or not you've got a darker colour or a highlighted colour is going to affect the shape of that nose. And then once I'm finished with that glaze and adjusting that first set of colour, that's when I go over to more of my lighter layers and I repeat the same process. So I'll go back and forth between my opaque layers, so that's my brighter layers where you cannot see through that paint, and then back with my glazes to adjust that colour. I personally really like that layering process. I feel like I get more depth when I work in that way. So I really do want to make sure that I've got as much depth, that three-dimensional shape, as I possibly can. This painting is only on a 20 centimetre canvas board, so it's actually quite small. In relation to how big this nose is to the size of my brush, I'm not working on a massive area. But if I make sure I use my brush in the right way with the correct techniques, I can achieve a huge amount of detail here. But it's really important not to overwork an area or speed anything up unnecessarily. It's very easy to just think, oh, the nose isn't as important, I want to focus on the eyes. But if we don't achieve the same feel with that nose, it's going to bring the entire painting down. Now, noses, without a doubt, can be one of the more challenging elements to get right, because there are a lot of those lights and darks. We want to make sure that that nose starts to look a little bit wet. All of that again goes back to our contrast. We have to make sure that we've got the darks dark and we've got our highlights bright. And it's also at this stage where I start reinforcing the colour and, most importantly, the contrast. The highlights here, in order to get that wet look, they have to be really bright. But they're only going to look bright enough if we've got our shadows dark enough. So you do really want to make sure throughout that painting process that your contrast and your values are right. So I do hope this video has been useful. As I say, if it was, I would be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. And if you would like to paint along and see the real-time version of this chocolate Labrador, as I say, my Patreon is in the description below. Now, I do have a huge range of tutorials on my Patreon channel. It focuses heavily on the pet portrait side of things. For any of my Patreon members who would like to potentially take on their own pet portraits, that range of subjects, dog, cats and horses that I have there will provide all of the tips and techniques, the processes that I like to use, all of the materials, so then Patreon members can transfer that into their own work. Now, of course, I've also got lots of wildlife subjects, so there really is something for everyone. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week. I upload 2 to 3 videos here every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then hit that subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching.